Yesterday we were talking about who gets to tell what stories, and I thought that we could stay there for a little bit, but I just wanted to share something. When I was younger, my favorite book was Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Judy Blume. And of course, the movie's coming out. And that book really, really helped me. Obviously, she wasn't writing it as a young woman. Thea, I wanted to start with you. When we talk about writing in someone else's voice, who gets to tell what stories?
I mean, to some degree, you always have to write in someone else's voice. I'm a mixed race Chinese and white woman who grew up in Singapore and in Toronto, and if I were to only write books about myself, it would be very narrow, and I wouldn't enjoy it either. So I think we always have to write in other people's voices, but of course there's always the question of how can we do it respectfully. I think I don't generally write in the voice of a character unless I've had enough real-life connections to that community to feel like I can do it in a way where I'm not telling the whole story, as we say, that I'm doing it in a way that, I don't know, doesn't cause harm, let's say. A lot of the time, though, I think sometimes people want to tell other people's stories, and it's worth attending to the voice within you to ask yourself why you want to do that. Often, I teach creative writing a lot, and sometimes I'll meet students, often white students, who will come up to me and ask me, well, how do I write a character of color in a respectful way? Because I want to write about racism. And I always say, there's so much to write about the point of view of white people on racism, and often authors don't want to take that on, but I'm like, you know that's an interesting point of view. People don't often write overtly about whiteness. Like, I think sometimes when we don't want to write our own story because we think it is more imperative or more interesting to write someone else's story, we're maybe not always being the best witnesses to our own story.
Well, I'll just go around the table and get everybody's viewpoint on this. Vincent?
Well, I think about the separation that you're alluding to, this sense that we're always writing about someone who is not ourselves, and that's inherent to everything we do as fiction writers. And so, just as a thought experiment, when I think about writing about physicians, for instance, I feel like there might be a greater separation between me writing about physicians and, say, engineers, or physicians and lawyers, physicians and teachers, for instance, than there is between me writing about a physician of one ethnicity and a physician of another ethnicity. And yet, I don't think that anyone would ask any questions for a moment if I were decide to write a novel in which I had lawyers and teachers and engineers. And yet if I were to write a novel in which there's a person of the purple ethnicity, and the purple ethnicity features very prominently in their narrative, I think I would receive a lot of questions. This is my third
Because
work
one is charged in a way that the other isn't, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right, because it's charged. And I think that is a feature of the discourse. But I'm not sure that it's something which the writer always needs to be subservient to.
Though when you write about an engineer, you probably want to do some research into what it's like to be an engineer, right? To get it right.
Yeah.
So I think it's the same thing. One is charged, I think, in a way that another isn't, but it's always about trying to get as close to the texture of real life, right? To have the resonance of the real on the page, and accept that when we're writing about people from different political identities than ours, then it does become charged. It becomes something that we have to, I think, be more careful and respectful about.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I think if what we're going to do is we're going to write about any world, whether it's a professional world or a world that's charged in an ethnic sense that we don't inhabit personally, then absolutely it's our responsibility to really write from a place of knowledge and a place of insight. But I'm uncomfortable with the notion that there would be certain voices which should not or could not write from other voices.
Why are you uncomfortable? Is that leading into censorship, or?
Well, I think it's leading into censorship, right? And I think ultimately the act of both writing and reading fiction is the act of taking a leap beyond ourselves. And that's the magic of it. And that's also where hopefully we gain insight into human beings whom we see and recognize as human beings, and yet who are in many ways different from ourselves. So to me, because the very act is this act of imaginative inhabitation of another, I think to go and start prescribing in absolutes who can or cannot inhabit the imagined act of writing someone else is completely at odds with what fiction offers.
And I think that's why in the end I would say do it, just don't do a bad job. Because I think in the end that's where people are getting into trouble. I think if you were to read, 100 books that were published in the last year, you would find all sorts of authors inhabiting, for example, ethnicities that didn't belong to them. But it's not raising flags if they're not doing it in a way that's a problem, I think.
Well, let's hear from this side of the table. You two have been very quiet. Liz, what do you think?
So the big dilemma in my life as a writer was actually not, it came about from taking too deep a leap into myself. So I wrote a collection of stories some years ago that were very personal, autobiographical, about friendships gone wrong. And I got into very hot water with certain friends and also with members of my family. Even though I thought I'd taken great pains at inventing, still, I mean, it was clear to me what I'd invented and clear to nobody else. So then the question became, all right, and even as I was writing these stories, I knew how close to the bone they were, and they were difficult to write. And at one point, I, who's a sort of a fictional Beth, if you like, that was the name I used for her, said, well, it's my life too. These things that are happening, that's my life too, and I have a right to write about it. Nevertheless, the consequences were severe for me as a writer, and that's what drove me into writing novels, which was something it forced me to make a leap of the imagination that I hadn't been able to make before. But we're even in hot water when we're writing about ourselves because our lives overlap with these other important people, our family, our friends, and so on. And some people take great offense and others take it in stride.
That's why earlier in another segment you said that it was dangerous to write about families. That's what you meant?
Of course it's dangerous to write about families. Yes, you're airing dirty laundry, or you're telling things that didn't happen, or I didn't see it that way, or what business is of yours to use this material. But of course it is the writer's business. And that's where a certain ruthlessness has to come in. If you're going to be a writer, you can't just be holding back, afraid to offend.
Do you think that there's a way that you could have fictionalized those stories more, like maybe set them in a different country or something like that, that would have made your friends able to read them and not think they were about them? Or was there no way to tell the story?
You either have a hard-hitting story, or you have one that is semi-concocted to protect yourself.
The emotional need. Yeah.
But do I wish I'd been better at fiction? Of course. Of course.
I didn't mean that. Yeah.
No, very much so.
Yeah. I mean, I say that as somebody who wrote a time travel novel about migrant workers journeying through temporal zones in order to write about my own life. People never ask me if this book is about me. It's 100% about me,
Yes.
but no one guesses that.
I was actually going to ask you that today. I honestly was going to ask you if it was
so
about you.
I was driven by cowardice. Cowardice is the mother of invention. Yeah.
Well, why did you feel like you couldn't write the story from your point of view?
I think I felt like, so for example, as a mixed race person, the question I used to get all the time is, what are you? Right? And so it felt like my whole life people were asking me about my identity and had their own stories that they wanted to tell about my identity. And so I didn't want to write about it, but of course in my heart I did want to write about it. And I was like, it came to me that like migration is a form of time travel. And I thought, well, I'll write an immigrant novel about time travel. And then of course halfway through I was like, oh, this is about everything that's ever happened to me. But then it was too late, But I was lucky that, no one ever is like, oh, so how was this inspired by your life? I had written a realist novel before, which of course everyone was like, oh, that's you, right? But
That's such a whole. When people ask me what I am, I'm like, I'm a human being. But George, what about you?
Well, I think that the older I get, as a writer, the more of a liberal I become. And what I mean by that is I don't mind saying that I am far left in terms of my political sympathies, very far left. But I'm also very, very deeply now, especially a liberal, small L liberal, in terms of favoring freedom of the imagination, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, freedom of conscience. And I can't see any reason why anybody would want to be a writer and then put limits on themselves and put limits on what they can say and put limits on what they can think and what they can express and so on. I think that the great joy of being a writer is being able to put forward alternative ideas, alternative stories, to use your imagination, informed by research, to imagine particular situations, political, historical, artistic, and so on, and then to bring them to life for the reader. I mean, right now, this year, God willing, I should finish my epic poem, which I began in Zanzibar in February 2008. It's called Canticles. And the first 2 volumes of Canticles, which are already 1,000 pages, just the first 2 volumes of Canticles deal with history, specifically of slavery and anti-slavery, imperialism and anti-imperialism. And to write those poems, which are mainly dramatic monologues, I had to revive, so to speak, dead characters from history and infuse them with my language. And I'm following Walt Whitman, who says in the preface to Leaves of Grass, the greatest poet pulls the dead out of their coffins and stands them up on their feet. And so I write about Caesar. I write about Hannibal. I write about Cleopatra. I write about Marie de Gite. I write about the black woman who was accused of setting fire to Montreal, Marie-Joseph Angelique, and burning a good chunk of it to the ground, as she was right to do. But and never do I say to myself, I can't say this, I can't say that, I can't imagine it. The whole thing starts with the Odyssey, but I pretend that Ulysses is actually Ulysses X, who's a character from the autobiography of Malcolm X. And so I retell the story of the Odyssey through this African-American voice and so on. And then I move from that, so the whole work begins with that. Oh, it begins with Dante. It begins with Dante, and he's at the tomb. I have Dante visiting a tomb in Ravenna, and he's visiting a cemetery, and then he begins to speak about all these historical personages as he's getting ready to write the Divine Comedy, right? And then the whole work ends, 1949. Those first 2 volumes, Canticles 1, 2016, 2017, ends in 1949 with Mao's triumph in China, which I believe actually has set the course for world history into this century, well into this century. I think we're seeing the consequences of that victory in 1949 playing out right now.
I love this conversation because we're talking about history, we're talking about learning, and there's no better place to be than here, frankly. But Vincent, we're talking about nonfiction and fiction, and you've said, quote, "There's no better place in exploring lives than through fiction." What did you mean by that?
Well, it's really an observation that comes from the sense I have that in so much of modern political discourse, it's meant to be reductionistic, it's meant to simplify things, ideally to polarize them. Polarizing is very nice because if you polarize a group of people, then you can sort of pull them to this side or that side and claim them as your supporters and win elections and fund things. And so it's very convenient. And polarization is also very convenient because it means that people don't ask uncomfortable or difficult questions.
And also, too, you have you have a villain, and I guess
that's right. Yeah, you've got a good guy, a bad guy. We the virtuous, and the rest who are, if you're in a good mood, they're ignorant, and if you're feeling nasty, then they're just evil, bad people. So that's kind of the form of a lot of political discourse. But you can't really either write good fiction or, I think, read good fiction attentively and stay in that space.
Well, Liz, you've said that writing fiction is freedom. What did you mean by that?
Did I say that?
You did. I've done my research on all of you. You actually said it right here in studio when you were talking to Steve Paikin.
Good Lord. Well, I actually love it when fiction and nonfiction meld. So I love the real. I mean, I'm an old journalist, and I love concrete detail and how things happen and what happens, and melding that into a story using whatever other elements are available to you. So for a long time, I have to tell you, I hated the word fiction. I didn't really understand it. I didn't know how to do it. And
So you hated it because you didn't understand, or why did you hate it?
I suppose, well, mainly because I couldn't do it. Had no clue how to enter fiction. I would write a page, a so-called fictional page, and be, bored to tears by the end. Rather sell pizza than make up this fake, concocted, meaningless drivel. So it's in the loosening up and trying to find a way to write what really matters to you that kind of got me going. And then, as I say, I did have to finally make that leap into novels to protect myself from my family and others who were annoyed with me.
I think when I was growing up anyway, I thought that people who wrote memoirs had lived these incredible lives, and they wrote it at a certain point in their lives, maybe when they were looking back at it. Can you write a memoir at any age, at any stage of life, George?
Yes, absolutely. And that, as soon as I say that, I've got to start thinking, okay, which one would I point to or choose and so on. Well, I already mentioned the autobiography of Malcolm X, which of course is finished just before his assassination in 1965. He's 39 years old. So if he had lived beyond February 21, 65, I'm sure he would have had a much longer autobiography and maybe somewhat different as well if he'd gotten to write it as a senior citizen, for instance, or rewrite it as a senior citizen.
Imagine if he hadn't.
Yeah. Well, we are so blessed, in my opinion, that he did manage to get that work completed at the time that he did. And I'm also thinking of the French writer Violette Leduc, who's actually the inventor of écriture féminine. Écriture féminine. She invented it with her great memoir published in 1964. La Bâtarde is the title in French, and of course in English translation, The Bastard. And it's her memoir about her life. And I think by the time she got that book published, she was probably in her 50s. So it's not, the memoir of young, but then I could think of other memoirs written by persons much younger and which have a great impact or great effect. So I don't think it's really age that matters so much as it is the vigor with which one has to tell the tale of one's life and what the lessons of that living might be. I mean, one of the great things about the dead, I gotta say, not the Grateful Dead, but the dead in
The
general.
story?
Yeah.
No, the dead.
The band?
Not the story.
No. But yeah, not the story either. The great thing about the dead is they have all this wonderful lived experience that we get to mine if we choose to.
And then they can't criticize you, God.
That's right. And what I also love about the dead, Liz, is that they have absolute freedom of speech. They can say whatever they want.
No,
George.
they say whatever you want them to say, and I don't like that.
Based on research, Liz.
Yeah,
based on research and
No,
imagination.
I have great trouble with fiction writers putting made-up dialogue in the mouths of real people. I have trouble with that.
It's fiction.
George, I have trouble. I just want to know what's real and what's not real.
Yeah,
to a certain degree.
Okay, but
And
you have to
and
suspend disbelief.
I don't always do that.
I know, but that...
I'm a resistant reader.
Okay, well, you named it right there.
But These forms, though, that we're engaged in, where nonfiction can be looser than people think, and fiction looser than people think. That the memoir about my parents didn't start out as a memoir at all. It was short stories. I had this collection of short stories, and it was the editor, God bless her, who saw in that wobbly collection of short stories a memoir about my parents. So, forms shift around, and we make use of them as we can and will.
Form is as form does, as far as I'm concerned. And so the work takes the form it has to take in order for the story, whatever it is, to be told.
Yes, and often it's the editor who sees the shape.
I'm just thinking of something that, Liz, you were talking about memoir, and I'm thinking about how you said that was based on your life. When we're writing memoir, is part of the reluctance to maybe write memoir that you have to, you don't want to come off as being, I'm amazing, everybody's terrible. And I think it's kind of, I think it is hard to look at yourself and to see maybe the role that you played. So is there a little bit of that?
What you've reminded Liz that she said, that she said writing is freedom.
No, fiction is freedom, apparently. I said fiction is freedom.
Well, in
Roll
that
tape.
case, that is even more apropos my comment, because I think for myself, certainly, there are different types of freedom in the act of writing fiction. And there is one source of freedom which comes from knowing the world which one has fictionally inhabited. And I've written both contemporary fiction as well as historical fiction, which happened in places and times where I've never lived. But nonetheless, I had to research and understand that world until I convinced myself that I understood it well enough to write it. So there's the freedom that comes from knowing those tether points to the real world. But then there's another type of freedom which comes from shedding all that and saying, well, yes, I believe this could have happened because I know the world well enough, and now I'm going to make up what happens for my characters, and I'm free to do that. And I'm very hesitant to give up
That freedom?
either of those freedoms, But I think in memoir, and I've never written memoir, but I think one would feel some sense of obligation to not avail oneself of the second freedom, because it's supposed to be stuff that actually happened. Now, of course, memoir is about interpretation and is about understanding events from a particular light. But I do think you lose a kind of freedom, or I feel I would lose a certain kind of freedom by writing memoir.
Or,
So I'm gonna-
or in doing real justice to the characters, your mother, father. Actually,
You never could.
You're well, I think you can.
Okay, you're a better writer than I am. That's what you can
No.
do.
I mean, or at least you give the appearance of it. You make a big effort to do justice to them, and you get to know them far more.
Is one harder to write, nonfiction or fiction? Is one harder to write?
I think the act of writing both of them is not that different, right? Nonfiction always has a lot in it that's not true. Like, for example, we're creating nonfiction media right now, but there's going to be so many cuts and changes. You're going to make me look smarter than I am. And when you're writing fiction, obviously, as we've talked about, so much of it is true. So in either way, you're kind of handcuffing yourself to certain terms. Like when you say something is true, think of how it feels in your body when you see that card at the beginning of a movie that says based on a true story. There's a slight change in your brain, and you approach it differently. And you expect it to be true, and that's the contract a writer is entering into with the reader. And then when you say it's fiction, you're saying this isn't true, but I better make it feel like it is true. So either way, they actually don't seem that different to me. Obviously, in the end, the consequences are different, but the act of doing it, it's both. With both of them, you're shaping a story, right? You're taking material and you're making it into something cohesive.
Anyone else?
Well, time for me once again
But
to
no, but you have
exercise
to answer
my
the question
prerogative.
first. Is
I
one harder
answer-
to
It's
write?
his prerogative.
I am answering the question. I would say that they are equally delightful to write, and I agree with Thea that there's always a mix of fiction in the nonfiction and of nonfiction in the fiction. So the poem I want to share is titled Hammond's Plains African Baptist Church. And it deals with a historical incident which did happen, truly did happen. But this is my depiction of it in free verse. Drunk with light, I think of maritime country. I cry Birchtown blues, the stark, sad beauty of this Cimmerian land. I dream of a faithful dory battling the blue, cruel combers of a feral, runaway ocean, a Trotskyite ocean in permanent revolution, turning fluid ideas over and over in its Leviathan mind, turning driftwood drums and conundrums over and over. Then, crazy with righteous anger, I think of Lydia Jackson, slave Madonna, soon rich with child, whose Nova Scotian owner, the distinguished Dr. Bowman, kicked her hard in the stomach, struck her viciously with fire tongs, and then went out upon the ocean in his dory to commune with God.
And with that, we'll wrap up this discussion. And tomorrow, we will be discussing with our writers how to build a literary canon, which is kind of a controversial topic. But yeah, so we'll be talking about that tomorrow. And George, thank you so much for that.
Oh,
Appreciate it.
man, thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.